Part 1, The Silence Before the Storm, 1933 to 1938. The story of the Holocaust does not begin with war. It begins with words spoken on radio waves, printed in newspapers, whispered in classrooms, and shouted from podiums. It begins in the hearts of people who chose to look away, and in the minds of those who believed that hatred could be justified. In 1933, Germany was a wounded nation. The First World War had left it humiliated, burdened by debt, and divided in spirit. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the country of territory, power, and pride. Unemployment was high, the people were restless. Into that desperation stepped a man who promised revival, Adolf Hitler. When Hitler became Chancellor on January 30, 1933, few could imagine that the machinery of murder was already turning. The Nazis spoke of unity, purity, and strength, words that disguised something far darker. Within weeks, democracy was dismantled. Political opponents were silenced. Books that questioned Nazi ideals were burned in public squares as crowds cheered. In Berlin, university students tossed volumes by Einstein, Freud, and countless Jewish scholars into the flames. Propaganda became the air Germans breathed. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, orchestrated a campaign unlike any in history. Posters filled with caricatures and lies depicted Jewish people as corrupt, greedy, and untrustworthy. Radio broadcasts repeated the same hateful rhythm day after day. Children were taught in schools that Jews were subhuman, parasites on the body of the nation. For ordinary Jewish families, life began to shrink. Shops that once welcomed customers now bore signs that read, "Jews not allowed." Doctors, lawyers, teachers, professionals who had built lives and reputations, were dismissed from their jobs. Neighbors who had once shared meals began to look away. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their citizenship. They could no longer marry non-Jews, could not vote, could not hold public office. Overnight, they became outsiders in their own homeland. Many thought this humiliation would pass. Few yet understood that this was only the beginning. The warning signs in cities like Frankfurt and Munich, whispers spread, rumors that something worse was coming. Some Jewish families fled. They packed what little they could and boarded trains bound for France, the Netherlands, or America. But for most, leaving was impossible. The world's borders were closing. Nations feared an influx of refugees. Even the United States and Britain set strict immigration quotas for those who stayed. Daily life became a careful act of survival. Children learned not to draw attention to themselves. Business owners changed names, disguising Jewish origins. Synagogues remained places of faith but also of fear. And yet, amidst the tightening grip, people tried to live, to marry, to celebrate births, to sing songs that reminded them of who they were. Among them was Ruth Adler, a young girl from Berlin, who would later recall, "I remember my father taking my hand one morning to school. He stopped at the gate and looked at the teachers' faces. There was no welcome anymore. Just a silence that said everything." That silence, cold, deliberate, and heavy, was the true beginning of the Holocaust. The night of broken glass. By November 1938, the illusion of normal life shattered. On the night of November 9, Nazi officials organized a nationwide pogrom, a violent, coordinated attack against Jewish communities. It became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, mobs destroyed over 7,000 Jewish businesses and burned more than 1,400 synagogues. Jewish men were beaten in the streets, dragged from their homes, and sent to concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald. Windows of Jewish shops sparkled with shattered glass, hence the name. A witness, Herschel Klein, recalled, "The streets glowed red. The smell of burning books, burning homes, burning memories. I saw my rabbi crying as our synagogue fell. And no one stopped it." Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested in just 2 days. Insurance companies refused to pay for damages. Instead, the Jewish community was fined 1 billion Reichsmarks for the destruction done to them. The message was clear: there was no place for Jews in Hitler's Germany. The world watches. Around the world, newspapers reported the horror of Kristallnacht, but responses were weak. Editorials condemned the violence, yet few nations offered refuge. In July 1938, months before the pogrom, Representatives from 32 countries had met in Evian, France, to discuss the growing refugee crisis. Only one country, the Dominican Republic, agreed to accept a significant number of Jewish refugees. The rest found excuses: "We are full, our economy cannot support more immigrants, they will not integrate." For Jewish families across Europe, hope was fading. The borders were closing, and hatred was becoming law. A machinery of evil behind the scenes, the Nazi regime was already planning something more systematic. In 1936, the first concentration camps began to expand. Initially meant for political prisoners, communists, socialists, and critics of the regime, they became laboratories of cruelty. Guards were trained to dehumanize inmates, to turn violence into routine. By 1938, new camps were being built across Germany and Austria. Each had the same design: barbed wire, guard towers, barracks, and crematoriums. The camps were not yet the extermination centers they would become, but they were rehearsal grounds. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and worked to death in quarries and factories. SS officers perfected their methods of control, forcing inmates to salute their captors, punishing them for speaking, even for crying. This system of camps, small at first, would soon grow into an industrial network of death. The roots of hatred. To understand how an entire nation could turn on its own citizens, one must look deeper, not just at Hitler, but at the society that followed him. Years of propaganda, fear, and economic hardship had created fertile soil for hatred. Ordinary Germans, teachers, shopkeepers, policemen, became silent participants. Some out of fear, others out of belief. The idea that Jews were the enemy of the nation was repeated so often that it began to sound like truth. As survivor Simon Wiesenthal later said, the Holocaust was not the work of monsters. It was the work of men. And that is what makes it so terrifying. By 1938, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe. In March, Hitler annexed Austria. In September, he took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. The world appeased him, hoping to avoid another world war. But in the shadows of these political triumphs, the fate of millions was already sealed. The last glimpse of normal for many Jewish families. 1938 was the last year of ordinary life. In cities across Germany, Poland, and Austria, people celebrated weddings, attended schools, played in parks, unaware that within months, those same places would become prisons or ruins. In Vienna, a young boy named Samuel Rosenfeld later remembered his final day of childhood freedom. "I went with my mother to buy bread. The baker, who had known us for years, refused to serve us. He said, 'I can't, they will come for me if I do.' I didn't understand. I just held her hand tighter." That moment, a mother and son walking away from a bakery, became the symbol of what was being lost: trust, community, humanity. A storm approaches. By the end of 1938, Hitler's Germany had become a nation built on fear and obedience. Citizens were taught to spy on one another. Children were encouraged to report parents who spoke against the Führer. The Gestapo's presence was everywhere, though often invisible: a whisper, a knock at midnight, a sudden disappearance. Europe stood silent as the tide of darkness rose, and in that silence, trains were being built, camps were being expanded, and the final plans were being drafted. No one could yet imagine the scale of what was coming, but for millions, the world of safety and normalcy had already ended. Part 2, The World Turns Dark, 1939 to 1941. The storm that had been gathering for years finally broke on September 1, 1939. At dawn, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. The sky filled with the sound of engines, bombs, and gunfire. Within weeks, the world was at war again. For the Jewish people of Europe, the invasion of Poland was not only the beginning of World War II, it was the beginning of annihilation. The fall of Poland. Poland fell quickly, crushed between two invading forces. To the west came Hitler's Wehrmacht. To the east came Stalin's Red Army, following the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an agreement that divided Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Warsaw resisted bravely for 3 weeks before surrendering. Streets that had been filled with laughter now lay in ruins. Families fled their homes, clutching children, carrying bundles of clothing, running from the smoke of burning cities. For Jews, the German occupation brought an entirely new order. The Nazis wasted no time implementing racial laws. Synagogues were closed, Jewish schools banned, property confiscated. Jews were forced to wear white armbands with blue stars of David, so they could be identified at a glance. Polish Jews, more than 3 million people, found themselves trapped in a system of control and humiliation. The ghettos. By late 1939, the Nazis began gathering Jews into ghettos, walled sections of cities where entire populations were confined. In Warsaw, the largest of them all, nearly 500,000 Jews were crammed into just a few square kilometers. The walls rose high and gray, topped with barbed wire and guarded by armed patrols. Inside, the streets teemed with human suffering. Hunger spread like a disease. 10 people to a room was common. Families tore old clothes into pieces to make shoes. Children searched through garbage piles for anything edible, a piece of bread, a rotten potato, even coffee grounds. A young boy named Marek Edelman, who would later become a leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, remembered, "We didn't think about death then. We thought about bread. One more crust meant one more day alive." In the winter of 1940, typhus swept through the ghetto. Bodies lay on the sidewalks because there was no space to bury them, and yet, in the middle of this horror, people fought to keep a piece of their humanity alive. Secret schools were organized. Teachers risked their lives to teach children how to read. Musicians played in hidden basements. Rabbis held quiet prayers in candlelit corners. Even in the darkest places, there was resistance, not only with weapons, but with the will to remain human. Daily life behind the walls in the Warsaw Ghetto. An average daily ration for Jews was 184 calories, less than 1/10 of what a German citizen received. Smuggling became the only way to survive. Children, thin and quick, crawled through holes in the walls to bring back food from the Aryan side. Many were caught and shot on sight. There was also corruption. The Judenrat, Jewish councils appointed by the Germans, faced impossible choices: to follow orders and save some, or resist and risk the death of all. Some became tools of the occupiers. Others tried quietly to protect their people. Each decision was a moral wound, a question with no right answer. In one testimony, Rachel Auerbach, a journalist who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote, "Every day we asked ourselves what it meant to be alive. Was survival a victory, or just another form of dying?" The first camps. While the ghettos suffered, the Nazis were experimenting with a new idea, one that would turn murder into industry. Concentration camps like Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald already existed in Germany, but now, in occupied Poland, new camps were built on a massive scale. In 1940, the Germans transformed an old Polish army barracks near Krakow into a camp called Auschwitz. At first, it held Polish political prisoners and Soviet POWs. Soon, it became something else entirely, the center of what the Nazis called the final solution. The camp commandant, Rudolf Haas, recorded that he received direct orders from Heinrich Himmler to expand the camp and prepare it for mass extermination. Gas chambers were designed to kill hundreds at once. Crematoria were built to burn the evidence. By the end of 1941, Auschwitz would become a symbol of death known across the world, but at this moment in history, most victims still did not know what awaited them. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers stormed into the Soviet Union, advancing through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Behind them followed the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units composed of SS officers, policemen, and local collaborators. Their orders were simple: kill all Jews, communists, and anyone who resists. What began as shooting squads soon became mass extermination. In ravines, forests, and fields, entire communities were executed. One of the most horrific massacres occurred near Kiev, in a place called Babyn Yar. On September 29 to 30, 1941, over 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were forced to strip naked and walk to the edge of a ravine. There, they were shot in groups, their bodies falling into the pit. The ground trembled from the weight of the dead. A survivor, Dina Pranikiva, recalled in her testimony, "I fell before the bullets reached me. Bodies piled over me. I could not breathe. When night came, I crawled out of the pit and saw that the earth was still moving. People were still alive beneath it." Babyn Yar was not an exception. Between 1941 and 1943, the Einsatzgruppen murdered more than 1.5 million Jews in what became known as the Holocaust by bullets. No gas chambers, no trains, just open fields, guns, and silence. The machinery expands. By the end of 1941, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe, from Norway to Greece, from France to Ukraine. Jews were hunted and herded into ghettos and transit camps. The Nazis were now preparing for their next step, the complete extermination of the Jewish people. In January 1942, top Nazi officials gathered at a villa on Lake Wannsee, near Berlin. It was a quiet meeting, polite, organized, bureaucratic. Minutes were taken, coffee was served. The topic, the final solution to the Jewish question. 15 men sat around the table, lawyers, generals, ministers, educated men. They discussed logistics, how many Jews lived in each country, how to transport them to camps, how to ensure secrecy. At the end of the meeting, the Holocaust had become official policy, not a random act of violence, but a state-sponsored program of genocide, the sealed fate across occupied Europe. Deportations began. Posters appeared in ghettos ordering Jews to report for resettlement in the East. The trains arrived, cattle cars packed with people, 80 to 100 per wagon. No water, no food, no air. Journeys lasted days. Many died before reaching their destination. Few knew where the trains were going. Some believed they were being moved to labor camps, others hoped it was a chance to survive. But the names on the destination lists, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, would soon become synonymous with death. Voices from the ghettos. In the ghettos, rumors of mass murder spread, but few wanted to believe them. People clung to hope. Hope that the war would end, that the Allies would intervene, that humanity would return. Yet some understood the truth early on. In 1940, a group of Jewish scholars and writers in Warsaw began secretly documenting everything they saw: hunger, deportations, resistance. They buried these records in milk cans beneath the ghetto. Their leader, Emanuel Ringelblum, called the archive Oineg Shabs, joy of the Sabbath. He wrote, "We are not only writing history. We are saving the truth from death." When the war ended, much of this archive was recovered. It became one of the most powerful testaments to the Holocaust, words written not by historians, but by those who lived and died inside it. The disappearing world. Between 1939 and 1941, an entire world vanished. Synagogues that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. Jewish towns, shtetls, that had once been filled with music, laughter, and learning were erased from maps. Families were torn apart forever. Yet even as darkness spread, there were moments of light. In small towns, ordinary people, Polish farmers, French villagers, Dutch families, risked their lives to hide Jews. They became known later as the righteous among the nations. For every one of them, there were hundreds who turned away, but those few who stood up proved that humanity had not completely vanished. The edge of extermination. By late 1941, the framework of genocide was complete. The ghettos had become holding pens, the camps were ready, the railways were running, and the machinery of death was about to begin its most efficient phase. The world outside remained largely unaware. The Allies had begun receiving reports of mass killings, but the information seemed unbelievable. How could a modern, civilized nation commit such crimes? The truth was too large to grasp. But inside occupied Europe, the victims already knew. They felt the air grow colder, the nights longer, the trains more frequent, and still, they hoped. Because hope, even fragile, is the last thing to die. Part 3, The Final Solution, 1941 to 1944. By the end of 1941, the Nazi vision of a new Europe was no longer a political fantasy. It was an engineered system of mass murder. The persecution that had begun with words and laws was now carried out with trains, chemicals, and fire. The ghettos had served their purpose: isolation, humiliation, starvation. Now came the next stage: extermination. The camps of death. The first extermination camp opened in December 1941 in a small Polish village called Chelmno. There were no barracks, no factories, just gas vans and shallow graves. Victims were told they were being resettled for work. They were loaded into sealed trucks. The engines were modified so that exhaust fumes filled the compartments. By the time the vehicles reached the burial site, everyone inside was dead. Chelmno was a prototype. Soon, the Nazis built larger and more efficient killing centers: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Each was designed with chilling precision. Trains arrived daily. Victims were ordered to undress, told to leave their belongings neatly stacked, labeled for disinfection. Within an hour of arrival, most were dead. At Treblinka, 10,000 to 12,000 Jews were murdered each day. At Belzec, over 500,000 were killed in less than a year. There were no records, no survivors to tell the story, only ashes, scattered across the soil of eastern Poland. Auschwitz, the factory of death of all the camps, one became the center of the Nazi killing machine. Auschwitz-Birkenau.it began as a concentration camp in 1940, but by 1942, it had evolved into a vast complex designed for industrialized murder. Auschwitz was divided into three main sections: Auschwitz I, the administrative camp; Birkenau; Auschwitz II, the extermination center; Monowitz; Auschwitz III, a labor camp supporting German industry. The entrance gate bore the infamous words, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. It was a lie that greeted millions on their way to death. From all over Europe, trains arrived, from France, Hungary, Greece, the Netherlands, Italy, Poland. Each train carried between 1,000 and 2,000 people. The journey often lasted days. Inside the cattle cars, there was no air, no light, no water. People suffocated in the heat or froze in the cold. Mothers held dying children in their arms, whispering lullabies to drown out the screams. When the trains finally stopped, the doors were thrown open. SS officers shouted, dogs barked, floodlights illuminated the night. The prisoners were lined up for selection, a process that decided life or death in seconds. Men and women were separated. The elderly, the sick, and children were sent to one side, the young and strong to the other. Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, often conducted these selections with a flick of his hand. Those chosen for death were told they were going to take showers. They entered large underground chambers disguised as bathhouses, clothes neatly hung on numbered hooks. Voices murmured prayers, confusion, disbelief. Then the doors were sealed. Zyklon B pellets, cyanide-based poison, were dropped through openings in the ceiling. Within minutes, silence fell. The bodies were removed by Jewish prisoners called Sonderkommandos, forced to burn the corpses of their own people. They worked under constant threat of death, living in horror beyond imagination. Life in the camp as for those not sent to immediate death, existence in the camps was a slow, methodical destruction of body and soul. Dawn began with the whistle of guards and barking of dogs. Roll call could last for hours, in snow or rain, while prisoners stood motionless. Work began before sunrise and ended long after dark, digging, carrying stones, building roads, hauling corpses. Rations consisted of black coffee in the morning, a thin soup at noon, and a slice of bread at night. Disease spread rapidly: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The smell of burning flesh hung constantly in the air. A survivor, Primo Levi, described it in his memoir. Imagine now a man who has been deprived of everyone he loves, of his house, his habits, his clothes, of literally everything he possesses. He will be a hollow man, reduced to suffering and instinct. And yet, even here, in this pit of despair, there were acts of humanity. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread. They whispered words of comfort. They risked their lives to write notes, to pass messages, to remember names, to prove that they were still human. The experiments inside Auschwitz and other camps, Nazi doctors conducted horrific medical experiments under the guise of science. Children were injected with chemicals to change their eye color. Twins were dissected to study heredity. Women were sterilized without anesthesia. Prisoners were frozen in ice water to test endurance. The perpetrators called it research. The victims called it torture. Dr. Mengele became notorious for his obsession with twins. He measured their skulls, drew their blood, injected them with diseases, then killed them to compare autopsies. One survivor, Eva Moses Kor, later said, he was polite, even charming. But his smile was death. We were numbers to him, nothing more. Resistance and revolt. Despite the unimaginable conditions, resistance did exist. In ghettos, in forests, and even within the camps themselves, Jews and other prisoners fought back. In Treblinka, in August 1943, prisoners smuggled weapons and set the camp ablaze. Hundreds tried to escape, most were shot, but a few survived to tell the story. At Sobibor, in October 1943, prisoners led by Soviet officer Alexander Petrovsky launched an uprising. They killed several SS guards and broke through the fences. About 300 escaped, 50 survived until the end of the war. In Auschwitz, in October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando blew up one of the crematoria using explosives smuggled in by women working in a nearby munitions factory. Their final act of defiance became a symbol of courage in the face of certain death. Resistance also lived beyond weapons. In ghettos, rabbis continued to teach forbidden prayers. Artists painted on scraps of paper, mothers told stories to their children in hiding places, preserving hope with words the world begins to see. By 1943, the scale of the Nazi genocide was no longer hidden. Reports from escaped prisoners, intercepted communications, and testimonies from resistance fighters reached Allied governments, but disbelief slowed action. Many could not accept that such horror was possible. Still, the tide of war was turning. In the East, the Soviet army pushed the Germans back after the Battle of Stalingrad. In the West, the Allies prepared for invasion. The Nazi Empire was beginning to crumble, but for the victims, liberation was still far away. The death marches. As the Allies advanced, the Nazis began evacuating the camps, forcing prisoners on long marches through snow and mud. These became known as death marches. Those too weak to walk were shot. Those who fell behind were left to die. In January 1945, as Soviet troops approached Auschwitz, 60,000 prisoners were forced to march westward. Thousands perished on the road, their bodies lining the frozen fields of Poland. A survivor, Elie Wiesel, wrote later, "We were no longer marching, we were running like automatons. All that mattered was to keep moving, to stay alive." For many, liberation came only hours or days too late. The collapse of the Reich. By mid-1944, the Red Army had liberated parts of eastern Poland. They found the remains of Majdanek, one of the first camps to fall into Allied hands. Inside, they discovered gas chambers, crematoria, piles of shoes, and mounds of ashes. The world could no longer deny what had happened. As German forces retreated, the SS tried to destroy evidence, burning documents, demolishing buildings, but the ashes of millions could not be erased. When the Allies entered Auschwitz in January 1945, they found only 7,000 prisoners left alive. Most were skeletal, unable to walk, eyes sunken with starvation. Behind the barracks lay warehouses filled with human hair, glasses, suitcases, and shoes, proof of a genocide beyond comprehension. The numbers behind the horror. By the end of 1944, the Holocaust had claimed the lives of approximately 6 million Jews, two-thirds of Europe's Jewish population. Millions of others were also murdered: Roma and Sinti, Gypsies, Poles, Soviet POWs, the disabled, and anyone the Nazis considered undesirable. Each statistic was a human being, a name, a story, a voice that once laughed, loved, and dreamed, glimmers of humanity even in the shadow of death. Some people chose compassion. German industrialist Oskar Schindler saved over 1,000 Jews by employing them in his factory. Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg issued thousands of protective passports in Hungary. Japanese consul Chun Sugihara defied his government to grant visas to Jewish refugees. These men risked everything for strangers. Their courage became the proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were lights that refused to go out. The Nazi Empire was collapsing, but the suffering was far from over. As 1944 turned into 1945, Europe was a continent of ashes, its soil soaked with blood, its cities in ruins, its people haunted by what they had seen. The end was near, but for the survivors, the hardest part, learning how to live again, was still to come. In the deepest shadows of the Holocaust, when humanity seemed to vanish, there remained sparks of defiance. Resistance took many forms, sometimes armed, sometimes silent. Even the simple act of keeping a diary, of whispering a prayer, or of smuggling a piece of bread to a stranger was resistance. To survive was to rebel against the very machinery designed to erase you. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto, once home to over 400,000 Jews, rose in revolt. The Nazis had begun the final liquidation. Street by street, building by building, Jewish fighters armed with homemade bombs, pistols, and Molotov cocktails resisted the might of the German army. A young fighter named Mordecai Anielewicz, leader of the Jewish Combat Organization, wrote in his final letter, "The dream of my life has come true. I have lived to see Jewish defense in the ghetto in all its greatness and glory. They knew they would die. But they wanted the world to remember that they did not go quietly. For nearly a month, they held off German forces. Smoke filled the skies as entire blocks were set ablaze. The stench of burning brick and flesh lingered for weeks. By May 16th, the ghetto was in ruins, but the spirit of resistance had already become eternal. The Warsaw Uprising inspired others, in Vilnius, in Białystok, in Sobibor and Treblinka. Even inside death camps, whispers of revolt spread like secret flames. Rebellion in the camps in Sobibor, a killing center in eastern Poland. Prisoners plotted a revolt for months. They worked in the camp workshops, repairing Nazi uniforms and weapons, learning, watching, waiting. On October 14, 1943, the prisoners struck. Using axes and knives, they killed several SS guards, cut telephone wires, and stormed the gates. Out of 600 prisoners, about 300 escaped. Many were hunted down and killed in the forests. But around 50 survived to tell their story. Sobibor was later dismantled by the Nazis to erase the evidence. Yet the memory lived, proof that even in a death factory, courage could still exist. In Treblinka, a similar revolt erupted in August 1943. Prisoners overpowered guards, set buildings on fire, and tried to flee. Flames devoured the camp, and though most were recaptured, their rebellion became a symbol of human defiance in the face of annihilation. The righteous among the nations. Amid the horror, there were those who refused to remain silent, non-Jews who risked their lives to save others. In the quiet Dutch city of Amsterdam, Miepkes hid a young girl named Anne Frank and her family in a secret annex behind a bookcase. Anne's diary, written in fear and hope, would become one of the most powerful testaments of the ERA. In Poland, Irina Sendler, a nurse and social worker, smuggled more than 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. She gave them false identities, placed them with Christian families, and buried the real names in jars beneath an apple tree so they could be reunited later. When captured and tortured by the Gestapo, she refused to betray the children. In France, Oskar Schindler, a German industrialist and member of the Nazi Party, turned his factory into a refuge. He employed over 1,200 Jews, protecting them with forged papers and bribes. Whoever saves one life, the Talmud says, saves the entire world. Schindler did more than that. He saved generations. Life in hiding for many, survival meant living like ghosts, hidden in barns, attics, sewers, and forests. Entire families spent years without sunlight, speaking only in whispers. In occupied Poland, young children learned to remain silent for hours, to cry without sound. Mothers taught their sons to pray as Christians, to change their names, to forget their pasts, even if it meant saving their lives. One survivor later recalled, "I was 6 years old when I learned that silence could mean life. I did not speak my real name again until the war was over." Partisans and the fight in the forests beyond the ghettos and camps. Jewish partisans took to the forests of Eastern Europe. Armed with stolen rifles and homemade grenades, they launched ambushes, blew up trains, and rescued others from Nazi convoys. The Bielski brothers, 4 Jewish men from Belarus, formed one of the largest partisan groups, the Bielski Otriad. Their mission was not just to fight but to save. They built hidden camps deep in the forest, complete with workshops, schools, and hospitals. By the end of the war, they had rescued more than 1,200 Jews, the same number Schindler saved, but through the wild, cold woods. Tuvia Bielski once said, "Our revenge is to live." The cost of survival to survive was not only a physical struggle, it was moral, emotional, and spiritual. Many survivors would later describe the guilt that haunted them. "Why did I live when so many others died?" In Auschwitz, a prisoner named Primo Levi watched others fall around him, and later wrote, "If I was not a man, who was I? If I could forget that I was human, perhaps I could endure." For some, survival required unimaginable compromises, working in the Sonderkommando, forced to handle the bodies of the dead, or obeying orders in hope of living one more day. Yet within that horror, fragments of humanity remained. Prisoners whispered prayers in dozens of languages, sharing crumbs of bread, the last act of solidarity in a world that had forgotten mercy. Part 4, Liberation and Reckoning, 1945. By 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Allied troops advanced from the west, Soviet forces from the east. The camps, once secret, were now being discovered. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz. What they found defied belief. Piles of shoes, hair, glasses, and skeletal survivors barely alive. The soldiers stood in silence, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they saw. One Soviet officer later said, "We thought we were prepared for anything. But nothing could prepare a man to walk through that gate and see what was left of humanity." American forces liberated Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. The British entered Bergen-Belsen, where tens of thousands lay unburied. The stench was so overwhelming that even hardened soldiers wept. Film reels captured the liberation. Emaciated prisoners reaching out to their liberators. Eyes hollow but still alive. For many, it was too late. Thousands died in the days after liberation, their bodies too weak to recover. The winter of 1945 brought with it both devastation and deliverance. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was now in ruins. Cities lay in ashes. The echo of boots that had once marched triumphantly through Europe was replaced by the rumble of Allied tanks advancing from every direction. The Third Reich was collapsing, but before it fell, it would leave behind one final legacy of horror: Auschwitz. The gates of hell open on January 27, 1945. Soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army approached a small Polish town called Auschwitz. The men were battle-hardened, they had seen death on every front. But nothing had prepared them for what awaited beyond the gate marked with the words, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. Inside, silence hung over the frozen ground. Barbed wire cut through the snow like veins of iron. The soldiers moved cautiously through rows of barracks. What they found would haunt them forever. Hundreds of skeletal prisoners emerged slowly, blinking at the light. Many could not walk. Some crawled forward, reaching out with trembling hands. Their eyes, sunken, hollow, and ancient, held a pain no words could describe. Around them were signs of the industrial scale of death: piles of hair, glasses, children's shoes, and heaps of ashes still warm from the crematoria. The Soviets liberated about 7,000 survivors that day. For them, freedom had come, but it felt unreal. As one survivor later said, "We were free, but we did not know what freedom meant anymore." The world began to see, for the first time, what the Nazis had tried to hide. The photographs taken at Auschwitz and Majdanek were beyond comprehension, a crime so vast it defied belief. The Western camps. As the American and British armies advanced through Germany, they too stumbled upon the camps. Each discovery peeled back another layer of inhumanity. On April 11, 1945, U.S. forces entered Buchenwald near Weimar. They found tens of thousands of prisoners, Jews, political dissidents, and prisoners of war. In one barrack, children clung to life. One of them was a young boy named Elie Wiesel, who would later write the haunting memoir Nightpoint. 3 days later, the Americans liberated Dachau, the first concentration camp established by the Nazis in 1933. Even seasoned soldiers broke down upon seeing the emaciated survivors and the stacked corpses beside the crematoriums. British forces entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945. The camp had no gas chambers. Death came through starvation and disease. Over 60,000 prisoners remained, dying faster than they could be saved. The British filmed everything. Their footage, later shown around the world, forced humanity to face what it had allowed to happen. One British officer wrote in his diary, "We are faced with a pile of living corpses. They cannot speak. They do not move. They only look at us, as if asking, why did it take so long?" In the weeks that followed, Allied doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save those who could still be saved. But for many, liberation came too late. Thousands died in the days after, their bodies too broken to recover. The survivors' journey. When the camps were liberated, the world called them displaced persons, a bureaucratic term for people who had lost everything: their homes, their families, their nations, and often even their names. They wandered through Europe, searching for news of loved ones. Train stations became bulletin boards of grief, photographs and names pinned to walls, desperate notes written in dozens of languages. "Has anyone seen my sister? My child was on transport number 47. Some returned to their hometowns, only to find them gone, or hostile. Anti-Semitism did not vanish with the Reich. In Poland and Hungary, pogroms broke out even after the war's end. Many survivors realized there was no home to return to. Refugee camps were set up across Germany, Austria, and Italy. There, life slowly began again: marriages, births, schools. Children learned Hebrew and English. They began to dream of new lands: Palestine, America, Canada. Out of the ashes, a people began to rebuild. The world confronts the crime. When Allied forces uncovered the camps, they forced local German civilians to walk through them, to see the mountains of bodies, to smell the truth. Many wept, others claimed they did not know, but ignorance was no longer an excuse. The Nuremberg trials, held from November 1945 to October 1946, brought 22 major Nazi leaders to justice. For the first time in history, an international court tried individuals for crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: films, documents, orders signed in ink that led to the deaths of millions. Survivors testified. One woman, barely in her 20s, recounted the murder of her family in Auschwitz. The courtroom was silent except for a trembling voice. When the judges delivered their verdicts, 12 men were sentenced to death, including Hermann Göring and Joachim von Ribbentrop. Others received long prison sentences. But justice could never balance the scale of the crime. At Nuremberg, the world also heard a phrase that would echo through the generations: never again. The psychological aftermath for survivors: liberation did not mean peace. Freedom was followed by nightmares. Many could not eat without guilt, could not sleep without hearing the screams. The world wanted to move on, but for them, time had frozen in 1945. Some spoke of their experiences, others remained silent for decades. Words felt too small for what they had witnessed. As survivor Primo Levi wrote, "If understanding is impossible, knowing is necessary." He devoted his life to making the world remember, because forgetting was the final death. Germany's reckoning in post-war Germany, the Holocaust was a wound that many tried to bury. The ruins of cities mirrored the moral ruins of a nation. It took years, even decades, for Germans to face their collective guilt. In the 1960s, the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt reopened old wounds, forcing witnesses to recount their trauma once again. Slowly, education replaced denial. Memorials rose where death camps once stood. Children visited them to learn what their grandparents had done, or ignored. Today, Germany's remembrance culture stands as one of the strongest in the world, a model of acknowledgement and repentance. But it began with silence, shame, and the slow courage to look at the truth. The birth of Israel for many survivors, the dream of safety found form in a new homeland. In 1948, the State of Israel was established. For a people who had been stateless for 2,000 years, and nearly annihilated, it was both a miracle and a necessity. Ships of refugees sailed to its shores, carrying numbers tattooed on their arms. They built homes, planted trees, and built an army that vowed, never again would Jews be led like lambs to the slaughter. Israel's creation was not without conflict, but for the survivors of the Holocaust, it meant one thing above all: a place where they could finally belong. Remembering the lost 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. Among them were 1.5 million children, names never recorded, lives never lived. The Nazis also killed millions of others: Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners, homosexuals, the disabled, and anyone they deemed unworthy of life. Each of them had a story, a face, a song, a dream. The loss is beyond numbers. In Jerusalem, the memorial Yad Vashem holds the names of millions of victims. In one hall, the walls are lined with photographs: men, women, children smiling before the darkness fell. A voice recites names, one after another. It would take over 11 years to read them all aloud. Epilogue: never again the war had ended. The camps had fallen silent. But the echo of the Holocaust did not fade. It reverberated through the decades, shaping memory, justice, and the very definition of what it means to be human. The weight of memory for those who survived. Life after liberation was both a gift and a burden. They had been freed, yet many remained prisoners of their own memories. Some built families, new homes, new lives, but within them lived the ghosts of those who could not. At night, survivors dreamed of trains, of barbed wire, of the smell of smoke. During the day, they spoke little. The world was not ready to listen. The word Holocaust itself would not enter common language until years later, but as time passed, the silence began to break. Survivors wrote books, gave testimony, and told their stories in schools, courts, and synagogues. They spoke for those whose voices had been extinguished. In 1959, and Frank's diary became required reading in many countries, the voice of a young girl who had dreamed of peace in a world of hatred. In her words, the world heard not only sorrow but hope. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. It was a fragile hope, but it endured. The global impact. The Holocaust changed not only the lives of those who lived through it, but also the conscience of the world. The phrase, crimes against humanity, entered international law because of it. The United Nations, formed in 1945, made human rights a cornerstone of its mission. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, a direct answer to the horrors that had just unfolded. Its first line declared, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." It was more than idealism, it was a vow that never again would the world stand idle as evil consumed the innocent, yet history would test that vow again and again, in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and beyond. The Holocaust became both a warning and a measure of the world's moral failure. The trial of memory. As the years passed, new dangers appeared, not in the form of armies, but in words. Some began to deny that the Holocaust had happened. Others sought to minimize it, to distort the truth for political or ideological gain, but history left too much evidence to be erased. Millions of documents, testimonies, photographs, and the ruins of camps themselves, all stood as witnesses. Holocaust denial became not just a lie, but a second crime, an attempt to kill memory itself. Survivors fought back, not with weapons, but with truth. They visited schools, wrote memoirs, built museums. Their mission was clear, to remember, so it could never happen again. As survivor and author Elie Wiesel once said, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. The children of the survivors, the second generation, the children of survivors, inherited both life and trauma. They grew up in homes filled with silence, where laughter often carried an undertone of sorrow. Some parents never spoke of the camps, others spoke only of them. These children carried invisible scars, the weight of memory they did not live but could never escape. Yet many also carried the determination to ensure their parents' suffering was not in vain. They became teachers, historians, artists, and activists, the keepers of remembrance. Today, the grandchildren of survivors continue that mission. They record testimonies for digital archives, visit former camps, and fight against the rising tide of hate in a world that sometimes seems to forget. The museums and the memorials across the world, memorials rise like scars on the landscape of memory. In Jerusalem, the halls of Yad Vashem echo with silence, each room a reminder of lives lost and names recovered. In Washington, D.C., the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum greets millions of visitors every year with the chilling sight of thousands of victims' shoes. In Berlin, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe stands in the heart of the city that once directed their destruction. Its cold gray slabs stretch across an entire city block, a maze where visitors lose their bearings, a physical manifestation of absence and confusion. Everywhere, the same message resonates: remember, the survivors are fading now, fewer with each passing year. Soon, there will be no one left who can say, "I was there." But their words, their faces, their stories live on in recordings, books, and monuments. Memory has become the new witness, the moral legacy. The Holocaust forces humanity to confront its own reflection. It shows how ordinary people, teachers, soldiers, neighbors, can become instruments of evil when fear, obedience, and prejudice replace conscience. It also shows that goodness, though often hidden, can survive even in hell. The righteous who risked their lives to save others prove that morality is not measured by nations, but by individuals. The question the Holocaust leaves behind is not only, how could this happen, but also, what would I have done? Every generation must answer it anew, never again, never again. The words have been spoken countless times, at memorials, at graves, in classrooms. But they are not just a phrase, they are a warning. Never again means never again to indifference, never again to silence, never again to hatred disguised as politics, never again to the belief that some lives are worth less than others. The Holocaust was not an accident of history. It was a human choice, a chain of decisions made by individuals who looked away, obeyed orders, or remained silent. That is why remembrance is not only about the past. It is about the future. In the ruins of Auschwitz stands a small plaque inscribed with words in many languages, "Forever let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity." As long as those words are read, as long as children ask what they mean, the victims live on. Eternal memory. Imagine the world before the war, the laughter of Jewish families on summer evenings, the songs of cantors in synagogues, the markets filled with voices in Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, German. All of that was nearly erased, but not completely. Every time a prayer is whispered, every time a survivor's grandchild lights a candle, every time someone stands before a memorial and weeps for strangers, something of that lost world is restored. The Holocaust was the darkest chapter in human history, but it did not end humanity. It revealed its depths and its potential for renewal. The survivors rebuilt. They taught, they loved, they remembered. Their existence is the ultimate answer to those who tried to destroy them. As one survivor said decades later, standing before a crowd of students, "You want to know what victory looks like? It's me, alive, speaking to you." Closing reflection. The Holocaust is not just a Jewish story. It is a human story, a story of what we are capable of when hate triumphs, and of what we must be to ensure it never does again. There are no heroes in Auschwitz, only witnesses. And now, we are all witnesses. As long as the world remembers, as long as truth is spoken, the 6 million will never be forgotten, never again. Never forget.